I often helped my elderly neighbor with her home library, and for that, she gave me a book. A week after her death, her relatives were on my doorstep with the police, saying, "You took advantage of an old woman to rob her." But what they didn't know was that it was all foreseen. Look, I get it. 22 years old, no job, living with my parents. I was basically the poster child for millennial failure. But when people started calling me lazy for spending time with Mrs. Harriet across the street, that really got under my skin, especially when it came from my own family. My aunt was the worst about it. Every family barbecue, every Sunday dinner, she'd make some snide comment about how I was wasting my prime years playing librarian for some old lady. She'd roll her eyes and mutter things like, "Charity case helping charity case," when she thought I couldn't hear. Real classy stuff. Mrs. Harriet wasn't just some random old lady, though. She used to teach literature at the community college before she retired. Sharp as a tack, even at 87, but her body was giving out on her. Arthritis had basically turned her hands into paperweights, and walking from her kitchen to her living room was like watching someone climb Mount Everest. All she ever asked me to do was help with her home library. And man, did she have books. Floor-to-ceiling shelves in every room except the bathroom. First editions, rare collections, stuff I'd never even heard of. My job was simple. Dust the shelves, reorganize sections, throw out the old magazines that were practically turning to dust. Nothing glamorous, but she always had fresh coffee brewing and stories that beat anything on Netflix. My brother thought I was nuts. He'd shake his head whenever he saw me heading over there with my cleaning supplies and say things like, "Dude, she's just using you for free labor. You want to help? Order her groceries online and be done with it." He meant well, I guess, but he never understood that Mrs. Harriet wasn't looking for a servant. She wanted company. Someone who didn't treat her like she was already halfway in the ground. The real drama started at home, though. My dad had been getting more and more frustrated with my unemployment situation, and seeing me spend hours at Mrs. Harriet's house every day was like pouring gasoline on a fire. One Tuesday evening, he completely lost it. I'd just gotten back from helping Mrs. Harriet sort through a box of old poetry books when he cornered me in the kitchen. His face was red, and I could tell he'd been stewing about this all day. He started yelling about how I was 22 and acting like a professional house sitter instead of looking for real work. Called me a charity case and said I was using an old woman's loneliness to avoid growing up. The worst part was when he said I was embarrassing the family by playing nursemaid instead of being a man and getting a job. I tried to explain that Mrs. Harriet wasn't some burden I was carrying. She was teaching me things, sharing stories about her life, showing me books I'd never have discovered otherwise. But he wasn't hearing any of it. That's when he dropped the ultimatum. Either I stopped going over there and focused on job hunting, or I could pack my stuff and figure out how to support my charity work on my own dime. He gave me until the end of the week to decide. My mom just stood there nodding along. My brother tried to play mediator, but eventually sided with Dad. They all thought I was being irresponsible, throwing away opportunities to babysit someone who probably wouldn't even remember my name in 6 months anyway. The thing that really stung was how they talked about Mrs. Harriet like she was some manipulative old witch who was taking advantage of me. They couldn't understand that maybe, just maybe, I was getting something valuable out of our arrangement too. She never made me feel stupid for not having my life figured out. Never lectured me about wasting my potential or compare me to my cousins who were already married with houses and careers. So I made my choice. Thursday night, I packed everything I owned into 2 duffel bags and moved into the old tool shed behind our house. Dad had converted it into storage years ago, but it had electricity and enough space for a mattress. Not exactly the Ritz, but it was better than giving up the one person who actually seemed to value my company. Living in a shed definitely wasn't part of my 5-year plan, but at least I could keep helping Mrs. Harriet without listening to lectures every night about how I was wasting my life. My parents thought I'd come crawling back within a week, begging for my old room and promising to abandon my volunteer work. They were wrong. Mrs. Harriet never asked why I suddenly looked more tired or why I started showing up earlier in the mornings. She just kept the coffee pot full and continued sharing her stories about the books we were organizing. She had this way of making every dusty old novel sound like it contained the secrets of the universe. One afternoon in late October, she pointed to a bottom shelf I'd somehow missed during all my previous cleaning sessions. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she asked me to check what was down there. She hadn't looked at that particular corner in decades, she said, and was curious if there was anything interesting hiding behind the newer books. I got down on my hands and knees and started pulling out volumes one by one. Most of it was standard stuff, old textbooks, outdated reference guides, a few romance novels from the 70s. But then my fingers brushed against something that felt different, older, more delicate. It was wedged way in the back, almost like someone had deliberately hidden it. A thin book in a dark green cover that looked like it'd seen better days. The binding was loose, and I could tell the pages were yellow with age. When I carefully pulled it out and read the title, my heart started beating faster. The Great Gatsby, first edition. From the looks of it, I'd read Gatsby in high school like everyone else. But this copy was different. It felt heavier, somehow, more important. The cover had that particular weird pattern that only comes from decades of careful handling. When I opened the title page, I nearly dropped the book. There, in faded black ink, was handwriting that made my stomach flip. Not just any signature, but a personal inscription that made me question whether I was actually awake or having some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Mrs. Harriet was watching my face when I looked up at her, and she had this knowing smile that told me she'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time. She nodded toward the book and asked me what I'd found, even though something in her expression suggested she already knew exactly what I was staring at. That's when I realized that maybe my family was wrong about Mrs. Harriet just using me for free labor. Maybe there was a lot more to this whole arrangement than anyone had imagined. The handwriting was unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. Flowing, confident script that belonged to someone who was used to signing important things. And the message itself made my hands shake as I read it out loud. To H, who always knew how to find the truth between the lines. F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'm not exactly a literary scholar, but even I knew what this meant. This wasn't just some random book club copy or a library discard. This was a personal gift from one of America's most famous authors to someone he actually knew. And that someone was sitting right across from me, sipping her afternoon tea like we just discovered a grocery list instead of potential fortune. Mrs. Harriet's smile got wider when she saw my expression. She set down her cup and leaned forward in her chair, looking more animated than I'd seen her in months. Then she started telling me a story that sounded like something out of a movie. Back in 1925, she was a literature student at Columbia. Her uncle worked in publishing and had connections throughout New York's literary scene. Fitzgerald was still riding high on the success of This Side of Paradise, and Gatsby had just been released to mixed reviews. Nobody knew yet that it would become the great American novel that every high school student would eventually have to suffer through. Her uncle brought Fitzgerald to a small gathering at their apartment, and Mrs. Harriet, who was just Harriet then, 20 years old and probably way too eager to impress a famous writer, spent the entire evening pestering him with questions about symbolism and character development. Most authors would have been annoyed, but Fitzgerald seemed genuinely entertained by her enthusiasm. When he left that night, he handed her this copy of Gatsby with the inscription already written inside. Said she had the kind of mind that could see past the surface of things, and that she'd probably understand his work better than most of the critics who were already tearing it apart. She kept the book through college, through her teaching career, through her marriage and her husband's death 15 years ago. It sat on that bottom shelf, forgotten under layers of dust and newer acquisitions, while its value slowly climbed into the stratosphere. I pulled out my phone and started searching. What I found made my head spin. Signed first editions of The Great Gatsby were incredibly rare. Most of them were locked away in university libraries or private collections that never saw the light of day. The few that actually made it to auction were selling for amounts that seemed completely insane. A signed copy had sold at Sotheby's in 2021 for $1.9 million. Another one went for $2.4 million in 2023. And just last year, a particularly well-preserved copy with a personal inscription sold at Christie's for $2.8 million. I showed Mrs. Harriet the auction results on my phone, expecting her to be shocked or excited or at least a little bit impressed with what she'd been sitting on all these years. Instead, she just nodded like I confirmed something she already knew. Then she said something that completely floored me. She wanted me to have it, not sell it for her, not hold on to it until she figured out what to do with it. She wanted to give it to me as a thank you for being the only person who hadn't treated her like a burden or an obligation, for seeing her as someone worth spending time with instead of just another elderly neighbor who needed help with chores. I tried to argue with her, told her she could sell it and live comfortably for the rest of her life. Maybe hire a proper caregiver instead of relying on some unemployed kid with no prospects. But she wasn't having any of it. She disappeared into her bedroom and came back with a yellowed envelope that looked almost as old as the book itself. Inside was a handwritten letter on her personal stationery, dated just 2 weeks earlier. The handwriting was shaky but clear, and the content was absolutely specific about her intentions. The letter stated that she was giving me the book voluntarily, without any coercion or pressure from anyone, that she was of sound mind and body when making this decision, that it was a gift, not a loan or a temporary arrangement. She'd even had it notarized by someone at the bank. Looking back, I realized she must have been planning this for a while. The timing wasn't random. She'd probably been waiting for me to find that bottom shelf, waiting for the right moment to spring this incredible surprise on someone who actually cared about her as a person rather than just seeing dollar signs. But at the time, I was too overwhelmed to think about the implications. I was holding a book worth more money than I'd probably earned in my entire lifetime, given to me by someone who had every reason to leave it to actual family members or donate it to a museum where it would be properly preserved. Mrs. Harriet made me promise to take good care of it, but beyond that, she said what I did with the book was entirely up to me. She just wanted to know that it would go to someone who understood that books weren't just objects to be bought and sold, but connections between people across time and space. I walked back to my shed that night, carrying a fortune in my backpack, and I didn't tell anyone about it. Not my parents, not my brother, not even my buddy Jake, who I usually shared everything with. Something told me this needed to stay quiet until I figured out what to do next. That was a smart instinct, because Mrs. Harriet passed away in her sleep just 5 days later. I found her when I came over for our usual morning coffee. She looked peaceful, like she just decided it was time to stop fighting and let go. The paramedic said it was probably her heart, quick and painless, the kind of death most people would choose if they had the option. I was devastated, obviously. She had become more like a grandmother to me than my actual grandmother, who lived in Florida and sent birthday cards with $5 bills inside. But I was also terrified about what would happen next. Mrs. Harriet had mentioned having relatives in other states, people who hadn't bothered to visit her in years, but would probably show up the moment they heard about her death. And I was sitting on a multi-million-dollar piece of their potential inheritance, with nothing but a handwritten letter and my word to prove that it had been given to me legitimately. The funeral was small and sad. Maybe 20 people total, mostly former students, and a few neighbors who actually knew her name. Her niece flew in from California with her husband, both of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. They seemed more interested in talking to the lawyer about the will than actually mourning Mrs. Harriet. I sat in the back and tried to stay invisible, but I could feel them staring at me during the service, probably wondering who the scruffy kid was and why he looked so upset about some old lady he'd barely known. After the burial, the niece approached me in the parking lot. She introduced herself as Linda and asked how I knew her aunt. I explained about the library work and how Mrs. Harriet had been kind to me when my own family thought I was wasting my time. Linda seemed nice enough at first, said she was glad her aunt had someone looking out for her during her final months. But then she asked if Mrs. Harriet had ever given me anything valuable, any family heirlooms or keepsakes that might need be returned to the state. I should have been honest right then. Should have told her about the book and shown her the letter. But something about the way she asked made me hesitate. There was a calculating look in her eyes that reminded me of my aunt at family gatherings, always keeping track of who got what and making sure she wasn't missing out on anything valuable. So I just said that Mrs. Harriet had been very generous with her time and stories, but that I'd never taken anything that didn't belong to me. which was technically true. The book had been given to me fair and square. Linda nodded and handed me her business card, asking me to call if I remembered anything that might be important to family. Then she got her rental car and drove away, leaving me standing in the cemetery parking lot with a guilty conscience and a book worth more than most people's houses. That was my first mistake, because a week later, Linda was back, and she wasn't alone. I was in my shed Tuesday morning, trying to figure out if instant ramen counted as breakfast, when I heard cars pulling up outside. Not just one car, multiple vehicles with that official sound of doors slamming and people talking in serious, clipped tones. The kind of sound that makes your stomach drop even when you haven't technically done anything wrong. Through my small window, I could see Linda walking up Mrs. Harriet's front steps, followed by her husband and two guys in uniforms. One was definitely a cop. I recognized Officer Martinez from a neighborhood beat. The other looked like some kind of detective, or maybe a lawyer. Either way, this wasn't social call. They spent about an hour inside the house, and I could hear them moving around, opening drawers, probably going through Mrs. Harriet's belongings with the kind of systematic efficiency that comes from looking for something specific. My hands were shaking as I watched them work, because I had a pretty good idea what they were hunting for. When they finally came outside, Linda was holding a folder full of papers and looking like someone who just discovered her lottery ticket was a winner. She pointed directly at my shed and started walking over with her little entourage in tow. I opened the door before they could knock, trying to look casual and innocent even though my heart was beating so hard I was sure they could hear it. Linda's friendly demeanor from the funeral was completely gone, replaced by the kind of cold anger that makes people do stupid things. She introduced a detective as someone from the county sheriff's office who specialized in elder abuse cases, said they were investigating reports of potential fraud involving Mrs. Harriet's estate. Then she asked if I minded answering a few questions about my relationship with her aunt. The way she phrased it made it clear that saying no wasn't really an option. So I invited them inside my cramped little shed, moved some clothes off the only chair, and tried to pretend this was a normal conversation between reasonable adults. The detective started with basic questions. How long had I known Mrs. Harriet? What kind of work did I do for her? Did she ever give me gifts or payment for my services? Standard stuff that I could answer honestly without getting into trouble. But then Linda jumped in with her own questions, and that's when things got ugly. She wanted to know if I'd ever been alone in the house with her aunt, if I had access to her personal belongings, if I'd ever suggested that Mrs. Harriet give me anything valuable as a token of appreciation. The implication was obvious, and it made my blood boil. They were painting me as some kind of predator who'd taken advantage of a vulnerable old woman, like I'd somehow manipulated Mrs. Harriet into giving me things she couldn't afford to lose. I tried to stay calm and explain that Mrs. Harriet had always been sharp as a tack, that she made her own decisions and didn't need anyone telling her what to do with her possessions. But Linda wasn't interested in hearing about her aunt's mental competence. That's when she dropped the bomb. She knew about the book. Apparently, Mrs. Harriet had mentioned the Fitzgerald inscription to her lawyer years ago when she was updating her will. It was supposed to be appraised as part of the estate, but when they went looking for it, the book was nowhere to be found. Linda had done her own research and discovered what signed Gatsby First Editions were selling for at auction. She accused me of stealing a $3 million family heirloom while pretending to be a helpful neighbor. Said I'd probably been planning this theft for months, gaining Mrs. Harriet's trust, so I could eventually walk away with the most valuable thing she owned. The detective asked if I had the book in my possession. I could have lied, but what was the point? They'd probably get a search warrant anyway, and then I'd look even more guilty. So I admitted that Mrs. Harriet had given it to me, but I insisted it was a legitimate gift, not theft. Linda lost it completely when I said that. Started yelling about how her aunt would never have given away something so valuable to some random kid she barely knew. Called me a liar and a thief and demanded that I return their family heritage immediately. Her husband tried to calm her down, but she was on a roll. She said Mrs. Harriet had probably been suffering from dementia or had been coerced into making decisions she wouldn't normally make, that I'd taken advantage of an isolated elderly woman who didn't have anyone looking out for her interests. The detective asked if I had any proof that the book was given to me voluntarily. When I mentioned the letter Mrs. Harriet had written, Linda scoffed and said anyone could forge a document after fact. She demanded to see it immediately. I went to my makeshift dresser and pulled out the yellowed envelope. The detective examined the letter carefully while Linda stood behind him, clearly hoping he declared an obvious fake. But the letter looked legitimate, and the detective seemed impressed by the level of detail. Mrs. Harriet had included specific information about the book's provenance, the date she received it from Fitzgerald, and her reasons for wanting to give it to me. She'd even mentioned notarization and included the notary's stamp and signature. Linda grabbed the letter and read it herself, her face getting redder with each line. When she finished, she claimed her aunt must have been confused or pressured into writing it, said there was no way a rational person would give away millions of dollars to someone they'd only known for a few months. The detective pointed out that the letter seemed to contradict Linda's theory about Mrs. Harriet being mentally incompetent. You don't write that kind of detailed, specific document if you're suffering from dementia or being coerced by someone else. But Linda wasn't giving up. She said she was going to contest the gift in court and have me charged with elder abuse, that she'd make sure everyone in town knew what kind of person I really was. After they left, I sat in my shed holding Mrs. Harriet's letter and trying not to panic. I'd gone from being unemployed and living in a storage building to being accused of stealing millions of dollars from a dead woman. Not exactly the kind of life improvement I'd been hoping for. My parents heard about the police visit within hours. Small towns don't keep secrets very well, especially when they involve local scandals and large amounts of money. My dad showed up that evening with the kind of self-righteous anger that comes from being proved right about something. He didn't even wait for me to explain before he started lecturing me about how this was exactly what he'd been afraid of, that I'd gotten involved with Mrs. Harriet for the wrong reasons, and now I was facing the consequences of my poor judgment. My mom was more worried than angry, but she kept asking if I'd actually taken something that didn't belong to me. Like she couldn't quite believe her own son would do something so terrible, but she also couldn't understand how else I'd end up in this situation. The worst part was that I started doubting myself. Linda's accusations were so vicious and so specific that I began wondering if maybe I had somehow manipulated Mrs. Harriet without realizing it. Maybe I'd been more pushy about the gift than I remembered. Maybe she'd felt obligated to give me something valuable because I'd been helping her with chores. But then I remembered the look on her face when she handed me that book. The genuine joy she'd felt at being able to surprise someone who treated her with kindness and respect. Mrs. Harriet hadn't been confused or coerced. She'd been deliberate and thoughtful about every aspect of her decision. The next morning, I called the lawyer whose card Mrs. Harriet had given me months earlier. She'd mentioned him as someone who could help me if I ever needed legal advice, though I'd never imagined I'd actually need it. His name was David Chun, and he specialized in estate planning and elder law. When I explained my situation, he agreed to meet with me that afternoon to review Mrs. Harriet's letter and discuss my options. That meeting changed everything. David looked over the documentation and told me that I had a much stronger legal position than Linda probably realized. The letter was detailed and specific. The notarization was legitimate, and there was no evidence of coercion or mental incompetence on Mrs. Harriet's part. He said Linda could file a lawsuit if she wanted to, but she'd have a hard time proving that the gift was invalid, especially since Mrs. Harriet had been evaluated by her doctor just a month before her death and had been declared mentally competent and capable of making her own decisions. David also pointed out something I hadn't considered. If Linda really believed I'd stolen the book, why hadn't she asked the detective to arrest me on the spot? Why was she threatening to take me to court instead of having me charged with theft? Because she knew the gift was legitimate, but she was hoping to intimidate me into giving the book back voluntarily. She figured a young, unemployed guy living in a shed wouldn't have the resources to fight a prolonged legal battle against someone with money and connections. That's when I realized this wasn't about justice or family heritage. This was about greed, pure and simple. And I wasn't going to let Linda bully me into giving up something Mrs. Harriet had specifically wanted me to have. David Chun turned out to be exactly the kind of lawyer you want when people are trying to steal from you. Calm, methodical, and absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting his client's interests. He'd been practicing elder law for 15 years and had seen every scam, every family dispute, and every attempt to manipulate vulnerable seniors that you could imagine. After reviewing Mrs. Harriet's letter for the third time, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. Said this was one of the most airtight gift documentations he'd ever seen. Mrs. Harriet had covered every possible legal challenge that Linda might raise, almost like she'd anticipated exactly what would happen after her death. The letter included specific details about her mental state, her reasons for making the gift, and her understanding of the book's value. She'd even addressed the possibility that family members might contest her decision, stating clearly that she was making this choice despite knowing it might upset people who felt entitled to her possessions. But David also warned me that Linda wasn't going to give up easily. People got crazy when millions of dollars were involved, and she'd probably escalate her legal challenges before admitting defeat. He recommended that I prepare for a lengthy court battle and consider whether I was ready to deal with the stress and publicity that would come with it. That's when I made what was probably the smartest decision of my entire life. Instead of trying to hide from the controversy or hoping it would blow over, I decided to go on the offensive. If Linda wanted to drag this through the courts, I'd make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of person she was. We filed a preemptive lawsuit asking the court to officially recognize my ownership of the book and seeking damages for the emotional distress Linda had caused by falsely accusing me of elder abuse. David said this would force her to either put up or shut up. She had to present actual evidence of wrongdoing or admit that she was just fishing for a payout. The local newspaper picked up the story within days. Small-town scandal involving a multi-million-dollar book, accusations of elder abuse, and a family fighting over inheritance money. It was exactly the kind of drama that sells papers and gets people talking at the grocery store. The headline read, "Local man claims elderly neighbor left him priceless book. Family cries theft." Not exactly flattering, but at least they included David's quotes about the legitimate documentation and Mrs. Harriet's mental competence at the time of the gift. Linda gave her own interview, painting herself as a grieving niece trying to protect her aunt's memory from someone who'd taken advantage of her generosity. She claimed I'd isolated Mrs. Harriet from her family and manipulated her into making decisions that went against her best interests. What Linda didn't mention was that she'd visited her aunt exactly twice in the 5 years before her death, or that she'd never called during Mrs. Harriet's final illness to check on her condition, or that she'd seemed more interested in the state inventory than in planning a proper funeral. David made sure those details came out during our next court filing. We included phone records showing the lack of contact between Linda and Mrs. Harriet, testimony from neighbors about my regular visits and helpful behavior, and medical records proving Mrs. Harriet's mental clarity right up until her death. The case took 8 months to work its way through the court system. 8 months of legal filings, depositions, expert witnesses, and media coverage that made me feel like some kind of celebrity criminal. People I'd never met had opinions about my character and motivations. Strangers approached me at the gas station to either offer support or accuse me of being a gold digger. My family's reaction was complicated. My parents initially thought I should just give the book back to avoid the legal hassle, but as more details came out about Linda's behavior and Mrs. Harriet's clear intentions, they started supporting my decision to fight. My brother became my biggest defender. Actually, he started researching the case law around gift-giving and elder abuse, sending David articles and precedents that might help our argument. Said he was proud of me for standing up to bullies, even when it would have been easier to just walk away. The turning point came when David arranged for a handwriting expert to examine Mrs. Harriet's letter. Linda had been claiming that the document was either forged or written under duress, but the analysis showed clear evidence of natural, unforced writing patterns. Even better, the expert found subtle details in the handwriting that matched Mrs. Harriet's known writing samples from years earlier. The letter had been written by someone who was calm, focused, and deliberate about every word choice. There was no evidence of confusion, coercion, or outside influence. Linda's lawyer tried to argue that the handwriting analysis was inconclusive, but their own expert reached the same conclusion. Mrs. Harriet had written that letter voluntarily, with full knowledge of what she was doing and complete understanding of the implications. That's when Linda's legal strategy started falling apart. Her lawyer withdrew the elder abuse allegations and shifted to arguing that Mrs. Harriet had been suffering from undiagnosed dementia. But David had Mrs. Harriet's medical records, including a comprehensive cognitive assessment from just 6 weeks before her death. The assessment showed normal mental function across all categories. Mrs. Harriet had been dealing with physical ailments and mobility issues, but her mind was sharp and her decision-making capacity was completely intact. The final hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in late September. I wore the only suit I owned, a hand-me-down from my brother that was slightly too big, but at least looked respectable. Linda showed up with her husband and a lawyer, who looked like he charged more per hour than I had made in the previous year. Judge Martinez, no relation to Officer Martinez, apparently, listened to both sides present their arguments. Linda's lawyer made one last attempt to portray me as a manipulative opportunist who'd preyed on a lonely elderly woman. Said the gift was too large and too valuable to be legitimate, that no rational person would give away millions of dollars to someone they'd known for such a short time. David's response was simple and devastating. He read Mrs. Harriet's letter aloud in its entirety, letting her own words explain her motivations and reasoning. Then he presented the medical records, the handwriting analysis, and testimony from neighbors about the genuine friendship that had developed between Mrs. Harriet and me. The judge asked Linda's lawyer if he had any evidence of coercion or mental incompetence beyond speculation and wishful thinking. When the lawyer admitted he didn't, Judge Martinez announced that he'd heard enough to make his decision. The ruling was comprehensive and unambiguous. The book belonged to me. The gift had been made legally and voluntarily, and Linda's accusations of elder abuse were completely unfounded. Judge Martinez even included language in his order criticizing Linda for making false allegations without evidence and for attempting to profit from her aunt's generosity through intimidation tactics. Linda looked like she'd been slapped when the judge finished reading his decision. Her lawyer whispered something about appeal options, but she just shook her head and walked out of the courtroom without making eye contact with anyone. David shook my hand and congratulated me on winning what he called one of the most clear-cut gift disputes he'd ever handled. Said Mrs. Harriet would have been proud to see me stand up for her intentions and refused to be bullied by greedy relatives. That evening, I sat in my shed holding the book and thinking about everything that had happened since Mrs. Harriet first pointed me toward that dusty bottom shelf. She'd given me more than just a valuable piece of literature. She'd given me the chance to prove that I was someone worth trusting with something precious. But winning the legal battle was just the beginning. Now I had to figure out what to do with a $3 million book while living in a converted tool shed and surviving on ramen noodles and stubbornness. The obvious answer was to sell it, pay off David's legal fees, find a decent apartment, maybe even go back to school and figure out what I wanted to do with my life. The money would solve every practical problem I was facing and give me the kind of security I'd never experienced. But something about that option felt wrong. Mrs. Harriet hadn't given me the book so I could cash it in and disappear. She wanted to have something that represented the connection we'd shared, the friendship that had meant so much to both of us during her final months. I spent weeks thinking about what she would have wanted me to do, what would honor her memory and make the best use of the incredible opportunities she provided. The answer, when it finally came to me, was so obvious I couldn't believe it had taken me so long to figure out. The decision to sell the book through Christie's wasn't easy, but it felt right. Mrs. Harriet had always talked about books as bridges between people and ideas, connections that shouldn't be hoarded but shared. The final sale price was $3,050,000, which was even higher than David had predicted. After Christie's took their commission, and I paid legal fees, I was left with more money than I'd ever imagined having. But the money wasn't what made me feel successful. It was what I decided to do with it. I told the reporters about the Harriet Ellison Foundation for Community Libraries, $500,000 for the initial endowment, dedicated to supporting small-town libraries struggling with budget cuts. The first grant went to the Greenwood Public Library that Mrs. Harriet had mentioned during our conversations. I used another chunk from my own education, enrolling in a library science program focusing on archival work and rare book preservation. The rest went into investments managed by a financial advisor who specialized in helping people avoid the pitfalls of sudden wealth. My relationship with my family got complicated in ways I hadn't expected. Money changes things, even when you try to pretend it doesn't. My parents were proud but awkward. My dad made uncomfortable jokes about wishing he'd been nicer to Mrs. Harriet. The real test came 6 months later when they showed up at my apartment unannounced. All three of them, dressed like they were going to job interviews, wearing forced smiles that meant they wanted something. My dad explained he'd been laid off and was having trouble finding work. The family was going through a rough patch and wondered if I might help with temporary assistance. Part of me wanted to remind them about the ultimatum that had driven me out of their house, but mostly I just felt sad. I offered to help with specific expenses, mortgage payments, utilities, medical costs, but made it clear I wasn't becoming their personal ATM. They'd have to show receipts and explain how they were working to improve things. It was about being cruel. It was about making sure the help actually helped. The assistance lasted 8 months, until Dad found a new job. Our relationship improved during that time, partly because he started understanding that managing money responsibly was harder than he'd assumed. The foundation work became my real passion. I traveled to small libraries throughout the region, meeting librarians and community leaders fighting to keep literacy programs alive despite shrinking budgets. Every library had the same problems: outdated equipment, insufficient staffing, buildings needing repairs they couldn't afford. But they also had dedicated people who believed in providing access to books for everyone in their communities. The foundation grew from a single grant to a network supporting dozens of libraries and literacy programs. The most rewarding part was the archival work I started doing as part of my graduate program. I spent summers in climate control rooms, carefully preserving materials that told the stories of communities spanning generations. Now I work in the same library where I once just organized shelves, but as head of the archival department. Sometimes visitors approach me asking if I'm the guy from the Gatsby story. I just smile, because in my head, I always hear Mrs. Harriet's voice saying what she told me that first day I found the book. She said to always look for meaning between the lines, because that's where the real treasures are hidden. She was right about more than just literature. Sometimes the most valuable things in life aren't the obvious ones. They're the connections you make, the people who believe in you when nobody else does, and the chance to pass that kindness forward to someone else who needs it. That book changed my life, but not in the way most people think. It wasn't about the money or the legal victory or even the foundation work, though all of that mattered. It was about learning that sometimes the best gifts are the ones that come with responsibility attached, and that real wealth isn't what you have. It's what you choose to do with what you've been given.